The French army sacrificed over 150,000 lives trying to take it. The British left behind tens of thousands of corpses. Vimy Ridge was a flawless meat grinder, a fortress the German Empire believed no force on earth could conquer. But in April 1917, an army of loggers, farmers, and miners from a young colony achieved the impossible in just 3 days, utterly shattering the arrogance of Europe's most elite military. Welcome to Vimy Ridge, the bloodiest, most heavily fortified high ground on the Western Front. Based on the surviving tactical sand tables of General Arthur Currie and the final desperate letters recovered from deeply buried German bunkers, we are going to dissect a revolution in warfare. The Canadian Corps refused to blindly throw human waves against stone walls like their British and French allies. In this video, you will see exactly how they hacked the modern war machine. Prepare to understand how Canada transformed ordinary infantrymen into highly educated killing machines, completely rewrote the rules of the battlefield, and engineered the ultimate psychological collapse of the German defenders. To understand the sheer, suicidal impossibility of the Canadian objective, you must first understand the terrifying geography of Vimy Ridge. When we think of a hill, we think of an isolated bump on the landscape. Vimy was not a hill. It was a massive 9-kilometer-long escarpment that violently thrust out of the earth, completely dominating the flat Duois plain below. In trench warfare, high ground is everything. The German artillery spotters sitting at the crest of Vimy Ridge possessed a godlike panoramic view of the entire Allied sector. If an Allied soldier simply lit a cigarette in the trenches below, the Germans could see it and instantly drop high explosive artillery on his head. But the true nightmare of Vimy Ridge was not just the elevation, it was what the German Empire had built underneath it. By April 1917, the Germans had occupied this ridge for 3 solid years. They had not just dug trenches, they had hollowed out the earth to construct an impenetrable subterranean fortress. Using the natural chalk deposits of the ridge, German engineers constructed deep, reinforced concrete bunker systems known as Stollen. These underground cities plunged up to 10 meters, 30 feet beneath the blasted surface. While the Allied soldiers froze in the mud outside, the German infantry lived in deep caverns equipped with electric lighting, pumping stations for clean drinking water, telephone lines, and even a miniature railway system to transport ammunition safely underground. They had turned Vimy Ridge into an industrialized, self-sustaining mountain of death. The Germans had absolute, unshakable confidence in their fortress, and they had the bloody statistics to prove it. For years, the French and British armies had thrown hundreds of thousands of their bravest men at the ridge in massive, desperate frontal assaults. The Germans simply waited out the artillery bombardments deep inside their Stollen, then climbed the stairs and casually used their heavy Maxim machine guns to mow down the exhausted Allied infantry as they struggled up the muddy slope. The French alone had bled over 150,000 casualties into the soil of Vimy, achieving absolutely nothing. The German High Command viewed these Allied attacks not as threats, but as bloody, predictable jokes. So when German military intelligence intercepted reports that the British had withdrawn and the Canadian Corps was moving into the Vimy sector to spearhead the next assault, the reaction among the German elite was absolute dismissive amusement. You must view this through the lens of a highly aristocratic, rigidly disciplined Prussian officer in 1917. To the German elite, war was a sophisticated art form perfected over centuries of European military tradition. In their eyes, the Canadians were not a real army. They were a ragtag collection of second-rate colonial troops. They were uneducated lumberjacks, wheat farmers, and coal miners from the frozen edge of the British Empire. They were undisciplined, rough, and entirely ignorant of the high-level operational mechanics of modern European warfare. The German generals genuinely believed that if the greatest, most sophisticated military forces of France and Great Britain had utterly failed to dent the defenses of Vimy Ridge, a mob of colonial amateurs wouldn't stand a chance. They laughed at the impending attack. They did not reinforce their lines. They did not change their tactics. They felt profoundly, untouchably superior. But they failed to realize one terrifying truth about the men they were mocking. Because the Canadians were not bogged down by centuries of rigid European military tradition, they were entirely free to completely rewrite the rules of war. The Germans' aristocratic arrogance had just signed their own death warrant. To break the unbreakable fortress, the Canadian commander, General Arthur Currie, realized he had to completely dismantle the fundamental aristocratic structure of the British military. The British and French fought using a rigidly top-down system. In their armies, only the commissioned officers, the educated gentlemen of the upper classes, were allowed to hold maps, know the overarching strategy, and understand the specific objectives. The ordinary infantryman was treated as an ignorant, expendable pawn whose only job was to blindly run forward when the whistle blew. The fatal flaw of this European system was brutally obvious in the mud of no man's land. The exact moment the officer was shot dead, the entire platoon instantly lost its brain. The men would freeze in the open, leaderless and confused, until the German machine guns systematically slaughtered them. Currie decided to execute a radical, unprecedented concept: the democratization of tactical warfare. If the Canadian forces were going to survive Vimy Ridge, every single man needed to possess the tactical mind of a general. Currie ordered the mass printing of over 40,000 detailed topographical maps and distributed them to every single private in the trenches. He commissioned engineers to build a massive, to-scale sand model of Vimy Ridge behind the lines. For weeks, the lumberjacks, farmers, and miners were taken off hard labor and forced to rehearse the assault over and over again. They memorized every artillery crater, every German machine gun nest, and every barbed wire entanglement. If a Canadian lieutenant was blown to pieces in the first 10 seconds of the charge, the lowest-ranking private could seamlessly take command, knowing exactly where to go, what time to be there, and what to kill. But education alone couldn't stop bullets. To safely deliver his newly educated killers to the German trenches, Currie had to perfect the most terrifying, mathematically complex tactical hack of World War I, the creeping barrage. The old, failed European method of artillery was simple: bombard the enemy trenches for a week straight, then suddenly stop the guns, blow the whistle, and send the infantry charging. But the Germans weren't stupid. They knew that the sudden silence of the guns meant the infantry was coming. That silence was their cue to run up the stairs from their deep concrete bunkers, mount their Maxim guns, and butcher the attackers. The Canadians changed the math. They would not stop the artillery. Instead, the Canadian gunners coordinated an impossibly precise, moving wall of fire. They would drop a continuous, deafening curtain of high explosives right in front of the Canadian infantry. Then, every 3 minutes, the artillery gunners would mathematically adjust the elevation of their guns and move that wall of fire exactly 100 yards forward. This required a level of psychological discipline that borders on the superhuman. It birthed the infamous tactical maneuver known as the Vimy Glide. The Canadian infantry had to physically walk out of their trenches and march directly behind an apocalyptic wall of their own exploding shells. You must imagine the sheer, heart-stopping terror of this maneuver. You are walking upright into a deafening storm of shrapnel, concussion waves, and flying mud. Your own artillery is detonating less than 50 yards in front of your face. If the adrenaline and primal fear of combat cause you to walk just a few steps too fast, you will break the safety line and be instantly vaporized by your own artillery shells. But if the terror causes you to hesitate and walk too slowly, the wall of fire will move too far ahead of you, giving the Germans in the bunkers the precious seconds they need to run up the stairs and man their machine guns. The Canadians had to walk a razor's edge between suicide and victory. They moved through the freezing sleet and mud with cold, robotic precision, their pocket watches synchronized to the exact second. They were no longer a colonial mob. They had become a massive, synchronized organism of death, hiding perfectly behind a moving shield of fire, entirely invisible to the arrogant Germans waiting below. The trap was sprung in the freezing, pitch-black hours of Easter Monday, April 9, 1917, as a blinding blizzard of snow and sleet began to howl across the Douai Plain, blowing directly into the faces of the German defenders. The Canadian artillery commander gave the order. At exactly 5:30 a.m., nearly 1,000 heavy artillery guns detonated simultaneously. It was not a staggered bombardment. It was a singular, cataclysmic crack of thunder. The concussive shockwave was so massive that seismographs recorded the tremor, and the low, terrifying rumble of the guns could be clearly heard in the streets of London, over 160 miles away. Down inside the deep concrete stolon of Vimy Ridge, the German infantry felt the earth violently heave. The ceiling lights flickered and showered them with chalk dust. But the German soldiers were not panicking. In fact, many were remarkably calm. This was exactly what they had expected. Decades of Prussian military arrogance and years of repelling predictable British and French assaults had conditioned the German mind to a very specific rhythm of war. To them, a massive artillery bombardment meant one simple thing: the enemy infantry was not moving. The German officers calmly looked at their pocket watches, ordered their men to fix bayonets, and waited. They knew the Allied playbook by heart. Eventually, the deafening explosions above would suddenly stop. That silence would be their cue. They would have a precious 3 to 5 minute window to sprint up the concrete stairs, set up their heavy Maxim machine guns on the shattered parapets, and leisurely slaughter the exhausted, terrified attackers who were just beginning to trudge across the muddy expanse of no man's land. They waited patiently in the dark, treating the heaviest artillery barrage in history as nothing more than a noisy inconvenience. Finally, the pitch of the battle shifted. The deafening explosions directly above the bunkers seemed to roll forward, moving deeper into the German rear lines. The artillery hadn't stopped, but it had passed over them. The German officers blew their whistles. Now. The highly disciplined German machine gun crews grabbed their heavy weapons and ammunition belts. They aggressively charged up the steep 30-foot concrete stairwells, their minds perfectly prepared to look out over an empty wasteland and begin the familiar, mechanical work of mowing down the enemy. A German sentry violently kicks open the heavy steel door at the top of the stairs, stepping out into the freezing sleet to deploy his weapon. He expects to see a barren, cratered landscape. He expects to see the Canadians hundreds of yards away, struggling to climb out of their own trenches. Instead, he looks up, and his heart stops. Standing directly over the lip of the bunker entrance, completely surrounding the stairwell, are the Canadians. They are not hundreds of yards away. They are 3 feet away. Because the Canadian infantry had executed the terrifying Vimy glide, walking inches behind their own moving wall of fire, they had crossed no man's land completely undetected. While the Germans were comfortably drinking coffee and waiting for the artillery to stop, the Canadians were already standing on their roof. The psychological shock of this moment cannot be quantified. The German sentry looks up the stairs and stares directly into the black, gaping muzzle of a Lewis machine gun. He sees the razor-sharp steel of a fixed bayonet hovering inches from his face. He sees a mud-caked, emotionless Canadian farm boy holding a Mills bomb, the pin already pulled, ready to drop it straight down the enclosed, crowded stairwell. In a fraction of a second, the entire foundation of Prussian military supremacy violently shattered. The profound arrogance of the German defenders evaporated, replaced instantly by the purest form of primal terror. Their minds broke. The impossible had happened. The uneducated colonial amateurs had not only bypassed the impenetrable defenses of Vimy Ridge, they had weaponized the fortress against its creators. The Germans instantly realized the horrifying truth of their situation. They were not safely waiting out a bombardment in a fortified bunker. They had been buried alive in a concrete coffin. If they fought back, the Canadians wouldn't even need to shoot. They would simply toss a few grenades down the ventilation shafts and incinerate everyone trapped below. The collapse of the German will to fight was absolute and instantaneous. The elite troops of the German Empire did not fire a single shot from those stairwells. They dropped their heavy Maxim guns so fast they clattered down the concrete steps. Men who had laughed at the Canadians just days prior fell to their knees in the mud, throwing their hands violently into the air, weeping and screaming for mercy. The impenetrable fortress of Vimy Ridge, which had claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of French and British soldiers over 3 years, was completely hollowed out by a psychological masterstroke in a matter of hours.
The corned beef hack is not just a dark footnote in military history. It is the ultimate, terrifying aha moment about the true nature of industrialized warfare. This was not a clash of steel or a test of marksmanship. It was the calculated, surgical annihilation of human empathy. A soldier can wear a heavy steel helmet to deflect shrapnel, and he can dig a deep subterranean trench to hide from artillery fire. But there is absolutely no armor ever invented that can protect a human mind from the catastrophic betrayal of basic trust. The Canadian shock troops understood a devastating, universal truth of combat. If you want to truly break an enemy, you do not attack their weapons or their fortifications. You attack the most vulnerable, fundamentally human part of their soul. You take their deepest desperation, their rawest hunger, and their fragile flicker of hope, and you forge it into the exact blade you use to execute them. The psychological fallout of this tactic was absolute. It permanently shattered the minds of the German survivors. Long after the blood was washed from the mud, the psychological trauma remained deeply embedded in their psyche. From that day forward, across the entire Western Front, a starving German soldier would rather die slowly of malnutrition than ever dare to reach out and pick up an unexpected object from the dirt. The Canadians hadn't just killed men. They had successfully assassinated the concept of hope. The Canadians used cruel deception to engineer pure terror in the trenches. But there was another psychological weapon deployed in World War I that was even more haunting than betrayal. Imagine a pale, lemon-yellow cloud silently creeping across the cratered earth, making no sound at all, yet causing grown men to panic and physically tear at their own bleeding throats. How did World War I transform scientific innovation into pure, inescapable black magic? Click the video on your screen right now to uncover the horrifying, suffocating truth of mustard gas.